An American warship seizes an Iranian vessel moving toward the Gulf of Oman. Within minutes, crude jumps, stocks fall, and the ceasefire that politicians keep talking about suddenly looks like theater. That is the moment that matters, not because one ship changes the world by itself, because that one ship revealed what this war is really becoming. The real story is no longer only about missiles, blockades, or shipping lanes. The real story is that Iran is trying to drag this war onto the most dangerous battlefield possible, not the Strait of Hormuz, the credibility of the American system itself. That sounds dramatic. So let me slow it down for years. The United States has lived inside a very powerful assumption. The assumption is that its paper is stronger than everyone else. Reality, treasury bonds, the dollar safe, have and flows, financial trust, reserve status, America can issue claims on the future because the world still believes that those claims sit on top of the safest structure available. Is now attacking that assumption from the physical side. That is the key. I do not think the best way to understand this is oil versus bonds. I think the better way to understand it is through one phrase, real collateral versus paper collateral. Oil is real collateral. A shipping lane is real collateral. A choke point is real collateral. Refining capacity is real collateral. Jet fuel is real collateral. Treasuries are paper collateral. They are powerful paper collateral, central paper collateral system, defining paper collateral, but they are still paper claims resting on the belief that the physical world underneath them will continue to function normally. That is why this moment is so dangerous, because choke point wars test paper with reality, and reality always goes first. You can run a market on confidence. You cannot run an industrial civilization on confidence alone. You cannot fly airplanes with safe haven demand. You cannot move freight with a 10-year note. You cannot stabilize Europe with sentiment. If tankers are delayed, rerouted, or blocked, that is the point Iran is now making. And whether you like Iran or not, structurally that point is real. Look at the chain of events in the original incident. A ship is seized. Oil spikes more than 8%, equities fall again. Why? Because the market understands immediately that the issue is not the cargo on one vessel. The issue is that every future barrel now has to move through a corridor where military risk, insurance risk, and political risk are all rising together. That is why this hits so fast, because once crude climbs back toward $90 in an already fragile inflation environment, the problem leaves the Gulf and enters Washington. Now, it is no longer a shipping problem, it is an inflation problem. A rates problem, a debt rollover problem, a treasury credibility problem, that is the system chain, and the chain is brutal. If oil stays high, inflation becomes stickier. If inflation becomes stickier, the Fed loses room. If the Fed loses room, rate cuts get delayed or die. If rate cuts die, short-term funding gets more dangerous. If short-term funding gets more dangerous, the treasury market starts carrying much more strain. That is why the IMF warning matters so much. People hear safe haven premium is weakening and treat it like technical finance language. It is not technical language. It is the center of the story, because America can live with a lot of things. What it cannot live with comfortably is fighting an oil shock while the market starts asking whether U.S. sovereign paper still deserves the old effortless premium. That is the nightmare. And it gets worse if the system has already pushed too much issuance toward the short end, because then Washington is making one giant hidden bet. It is betting that short rates will come down. It is betting that inflation will cool. It is betting that the physical world will calm down before the paper world has to refinance itself at a new, uglier price. Iran sees that bet. That is what makes this warning more sophisticated than people realize. Iran is not just saying we can hurt you militarily. Iran is saying we can force your paper empire to answer to the physical world. That is much more dangerous because the United States is still overwhelmingly stronger than Iran in conventional military terms. That was never the real question. The real question is whether a weaker state sitting next to indispensable choke points can create enough stress in the real economy that the stronger state is forced to defend not only ships and allies, but the pricing logic of its own financial system. That is exactly what is starting to happen. Now, widen the map. Hormuz is already enough to shake the world, but Iran's leverage does not end there. The moment Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea move into the same calculation, this stops being a Gulf story and becomes a global transport story. And once that happens, the stress multiplies, because now it is not only about crude volumes, now it is about rerouting, transit times, insurance, pipeline dependence, port capacity, refinery scheduling, product balances. This is why the jet fuel angle matters. Most people hear that Europe could face a severe jet fuel squeeze and think it is some side complication. It is not. It is a warning that the product chain is more fragile than the financial commentary wants to admit. When aviation starts straining, tourism strains, When tourism strains, consumption strains, when freight strains, goods prices strain, when all of that strains together, the war exits the region in people's minds. Now it is no longer a war over there. Now it is a war inside inflation, a war inside travel, a war inside household budgets, a war inside central bank timing. Democratic governments lose room very fast once wars become inflation stories. That is exactly why Washington is trapped. If it tightens the blockade harder, it raises the very oil pressure that makes the inflation and rate story worse. If it loosens the blockade, Iran proves that choke point leverage works. If it widens the war and tries to solve the Iran problem permanently, then the China logic moves from background assumption to foreground reality. And that may be the most reckless branch of all, because more and more voices in Washington are saying openly what used to remain half hidden. Maybe this is not only about Iran, maybe the real strategic target is China, cut Chinese access to Iranian oil, disrupt Chinese trade through the Gulf, raise Chinese energy costs, turn Middle Eastern pressure into a China containment strategy. On the surface, you can see why some people think this makes sense. In reality, I think it is profoundly dangerous because Washington keeps making the same mistake. It keeps imagining China as if it were strategically isolated. China is not isolated. Every serious pressure campaign against Beijing as energy position creates stronger incentives for Russia and China to integrate faster, not slower. Every attempt to squeeze Chinese access to Gulf energy raises the value of Russian substitution. Every shock teaches Eurasian powers the same lesson. Route around the American system while you still have time. This is where American strategy can become self-harm. Washington thinks it is increasing pressure on its adversaries. It may actually be accelerating their consolidation. And if that happens, then the war produces two outcomes at once. In the short run, America gets inflation stress, debt stress, market stress. In the medium run, America gets faster de-dollarization habits, moral alternative settlement behavior, and a wider global appetite for reducing dependence on US-controlled financial plumbing. That is how empires accidentally educate the world against themselves, not by vanishing, by weaponizing their own advantages so aggressively that everyone else starts looking for exits. That is why I do not dismiss Iran's warning as just propaganda. Yes, it is political theater, but it is theater anchored to a real structural vulnerability. America as paper supremacy still depends on a world where physical flows remain stable enough to justify trust in paper. Choke point wars attack that relationship. They push oil higher. They keep inflation alive. They make rates harder. They complicate debt management. They weaken safe haven psychology. And they remind the world of a very old truth. A paper empire still rests on a physical world once that becomes visible. The real question is no longer whether America can seize ships. Of course it can. The real question is whether it can keep the physical world calm enough to preserve belief in the paper collateral at the center of its system. That is harder. So how does this end? There are really only three paths. The first is that Washington doubles down, tightens enforcement, and tries to break Iran before the financial consequences become politically intolerable. That is the cleanest fantasy, but it assumes the physical system will stay obedient long enough for the paper system to survive the stress. I think that is a bad assumption. The second is that Washington starts looking for an off-ramp and then rebrands partial de-escalation as prudence, discipline, or strategic success that lowers immediate pressure, but it also tells the world that Iran found the correct lever. The third is that the anti-Iran logic broadens into an anti-China logic, and then this becomes much bigger, much messier, and much more dangerous. Not because China collapses, but because Russia backfills, Beijing adapts, and the rest of the world adjusts even faster to a future with less faith in American paper dominance. I still think the second path is the most likely, not because Washington is wise, because arithmetic beats rhetoric in the end. Oil is real, inflation is real, debt rollover is real, treasury demand is real. If the war keeps pressing on all four at once, the American system eventually has to choose between strategic pride and financial stability. Great powers always posture toward pride until the last possible moment. Then they retreat towards stability and invent a story explaining why retreat was always strategy. That is the pattern I see here. The danger is not that Iran wins some cinematic military victory. The danger is that Iran proves something much more corrosive, that a weaker state sitting next to real energy choke points can force the strongest financial power on earth to defend the credibility of its own paper collateral against the reality of the physical world. And once that lesson is visible, everybody learns from it, markets learn from it, governments learn from it, China learns from it, Russia learns from it, Europe learns from it, the developing world learns from it. They learn that treasuries are still central but not sacred. They learn that energy routes can still discipline finance. They learned that wars sold as regional containment can become global confidence tests. And they learned that Washington may still be strong enough to dominate headlines, but not strong enough to keep the material foundations of its system outside the war. That is why this warning is fatal. Not because America collapses tomorrow, because the logic is cumulative. Every extra week of war raises the cost. Every extra spike in oil raises inflation pressure. Every extra inflation scare raises rate pressure. Every extra rates problem raises debt pressure. Every extra debt problem raises faith pressure. Strong systems are rarely broken by one blow. They are weakened by repeated moments when reality keeps forcing the paper to reprice. That is what Iran is trying to do now. Not defeat America head on, force America to defend the paper collateral of its empire against the physical vulnerabilities of the world. It still depends on. That is the real war inside this war.